Hi, Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 2 in our 6-video sequence of Psychology of Power. The first video in this sequence was really a definition of power. What is power? And in this one, we'll be talking about what it is that causes people to acquire power. And what we're seeking to deal with here is the question of how people have risen to power and to look at some of the research-based evidence as to why they have done so and how they've done so. But firstly, let's look at some examples. The first example we'll look at is Adolf Hitler. Hitler acquired power without much of a head start at all. He didn't come from a very distinguished family. He didn't come from royalty. But through the power of his public speaking and his ultra unethical way of dealing with people, he was able to, through a combination of kind of charisma and terror, to assume power. People who put him in the position of power felt that he could be manipulated, managed by those around him, but it proved not to be the case. So that's case number one. And in fact, the interesting thing about Hitler is that only a few years before he ended up being Chancellor of Germany, he was wandering around Austria, basically in poverty. He was living in a men's shelter. Remarkable, isn't it? The second example is Diocletian. And Diocletian, we're going way back to AD 240. Diocletian came from complete poverty and largely through military prowess was able to assume power within the Roman Empire. But he also turned out to be an enormous reformer in Rome, changed the power structures in Rome, changed the location of the capital, changed a whole bunch of stuff to make the empire survive longer than it perhaps might have without his reforms. I think the other thing that's interesting about Diocletian is that he's one of, I think it's only 2 emperors who actually ever resigned from the job. He got out while he still had his skin. As you may know, most Roman emperors kind of died in the job or were killed in the job, but Diocletian gave away power, which made him a very unusual individual. Let's look at some recent examples. We have Bill Clinton. He's an example of a person who came from very humble background to end up being President of the United States of America. Oprah Winfrey, not elected to office, but powerful nonetheless. On the top right-hand corner, you have Howard Schultz, who ended up being a very senior leader, chair, in fact, of Starbucks, and came from very, very humble backgrounds. Ralph Lauren in the bottom left-hand corner is somebody who, in fact, he was in the army and ended up being one of the most famous couturiers in the world, but also running brands which sell billions of dollars worth of product. And Margaret Thatcher famously came from a shopkeeping family, but assumed enormous power in the UK. Again, a reformer. Not saying that you love the reforms or you're favourable of the reforms or whether you do or you don't. One of the things that no one would disagree with is that Margaret Thatcher did change England enormously. So one of the things that causes people to assume power is cognitive ability. We tend not to want to accord power or follow people who we think are not as smart as we are. So smarter people tend to be able to, firstly, come up with ideas that may well work, but secondly, we tend to invest our authority and trust in people who we think are smarter than we are. Point number 2 is extroversion. Personality can be shown in a range of different studies to affect a person's likelihood of being trusted, and extroverts tend to be accorded power more often than introverts. I mean, extroverts tend to be often better public speakers. They tend to be often more prepared to grab the limelight. And so perhaps from a psychological point of view or a psychosocial point of view, it's not massively surprising that extroverts tend to get power. Certainly when we psych test thousands of leaders, the vast majority of leaders are extroverts. Now, that's not to say that there aren't excellent introverted leaders, but the majority of leaders are extroverts. The third point is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is a personality characteristic which indicates that people are kind of hardworking, organised and committed. And one of the things that we know is that if you want to predict who's going to make it to chief executive, conscientiousness is one of the personality characteristics that tend to indicate this. It's not easy to get to the top. And so the people who tend to get to the top tend to be the ones who are prepared to persist. Another thing about conscientiousness is that it's part of something that we call resilience. When people are highly resilient, very often they have the personality characteristic of conscientiousness, and conscientiousness and resilience together cause a person to be able to withstand negatives in their life, to kind of get back on the bike and start riding when things haven't gone well for you. The next characteristic is low emotional instability. And again, this is a characteristic of where a person has Emotional stability is able to cope, and that's another component of resilience. People who are highly emotionally unstable tend to be perceived by other people to be variable, to be you're not confident to approach them because you don't know how they're going to respond. And that makes us hesitate to give them power or authority. And as well as that, people who are emotionally unstable can often feel the pressure of stress more than other people, and that can cause them not to seek power as well. The next one is about physical attractiveness, but interestingly, Anderson et al. In 2001 found that worked only in men. Good-looking men are accorded power far more often than men who are not perceived to be physically attractive. But with women, it doesn't work. And it's maybe almost a kind of a sexism thing that if a woman is considered to be attractive, that may raise a question in some people's minds about her capability. I'm not sure what the reason is, but it's certainly an evidence-based finding that physical attractiveness in men can lead to them being given power, but in women it doesn't seem to work quite so well. The next one is breaking the rules. It seems that if we find people who are prepared to break the rules, now when I say break the rules, not to the point where you're doing something that causes you to be shamed socially, that causes you to lose your credibility with people, but people who are prepared to say, man, that's a rule, but I'm prepared to be a deviant in that sense. And by the way, one of the things that's a really important aspect of change is a thing called positive deviance, where a person will break the rules but to make things better. So people who are prepared to break the rules are sometimes seen as being more powerful purely and simply because they do that. The next one is about looking right, and we mentioned Rule and Ambati. What happened with Rule and Ambati's study in 2008 is that a bunch of organisational leaders were rated for the appropriateness of their look, and then the data from their organisation was correlated with the ratings. So people rated them. The people, by the way, were chosen not to be people who actually knew who these corporate leaders are. And so they would rate them about appropriateness, how suited they seemed to be in terms of leadership from their looks. And then the data from the organisation were things like commercial data, like growth and profit and that kind of stuff. And Rule and Ambati found very strong correlations. So it seems that good chief executives look right. Now, you've got a classic question of the chicken and the egg there. Is it that they're good leaders because they look right, or probably more likely people give them authority so that they are given good organisations which are likely to prosper to have responsibility for, and that may well be why you end up with this correlation between looking right and organisational performance. But again, fascinating. Perception of success. There's no question about it that if we perceive somebody as being successful in sport, or let's say commercially successful, they've made a lot of money, something like that, we tend to be more likely to accord them power because of that. Values match. This is from the work of Shalom Schwartz, who's one of the most important researchers in the world of values. And not surprisingly, we tend to be more inclined to follow people who we feel represent our values. So if our values are about, let's say, environmental sustainability, we're likely to follow leaders who take that view. That, of course, is the nature of how political decisions are very often made. We endorse the parties that we believe stand for the things that we care deeply about. Health. Certainly no doubt about it. People are perceived to be more appropriate to be leaders if they are healthy and fit individuals. And so people who have these characteristics tend to be more likely to acquire leadership than those who are perceived not to be physically hale and hearty. Obviously, it's a combination of a whole range of different things. And you'll notice that if you look at the leaders that we identified earlier, they would have a number of these characteristics that kind of drive the persistence, looking appropriate for the job, and also being physically well. The next video in this sequence will be about the neuroscience of power. And so what we'll talk about there is how power actually affects our neural structures to have an influence on what we do and how we relate with other people. Click on the link in this video to join us for video number 3.